Over the course of the next few lessons, we're going to talk about the common flaws that show up on flaw questions. I've done some really thorough and rigorous analysis, and I've identified 15 different categories of flaw. Some companies have a shorter list, other companies have a much longer, more granular list, more than 80 different flaws. I don't think that's particularly helpful. You shouldn't memorize this list, it's just good to know what's out there, and I've tried to lump similar flaws together, and that's how I've got it down to 15. It's also really important to recognize that not every flaw you see on the LSAT is going to be a common flaw. Analyzing some older prep tests, I found that about 90% of the flaws fit into one of the 15 categories that I've identified, and 10 of them were kind of unique or one-off flaws where you had to talk about what was going wrong, but there weren't a lot of other questions that had that same problem. And in a sampling of newer prep tests, the percentage of common flaws has gone down a little bit and the percentage of unique flaws has gone up. And these are always a little bit trickier. They're on the harder end of the test because you just don't have a precursor. You don't have something that you can relate it to anticipate how they might phrase the answer choice. So here are my 15 categories of flaw in order of decreasing occurrence. I'll show you a graph. This is their prevalence among that older sampling of prep tests from 30 to 55. This is roughly 10%. And here's their prevalence among the sampling of 15 newer prep tests. So you can see some trends here. Sufficient and necessary flaws have gone up. Basic logical gaps, linking assumptions, that flaw has gone drastically down. And so you can use the comparison from old to new to kind of see the trending direction of these categories. Now we're just going to focus on 5 types of flaw at a time, and in this first video we're going to focus on the 5 most common categories of flaw. Ignoring alternate explanations is a really common problem on the LSAT, and it's important to remember that explanations are like causes. So ignoring alternate explanations is like ignoring alternate causes, and both of those things are really dangerous and problematic. When you see an explanation, it's helpful to frame it as a causal argument. Let me show you an example. We've got Vinny's Pizza that sold more pizzas than any other pizzeria in the city, so therefore people must prefer the taste of Vinny's pizzas to all other pizzas in the city. And the problem here is this doesn't have to be the explanation. It doesn't have to be the cause for this phenomenon. It could be, we're assuming that better taste is why Vinny's is doing so well, but they could also just have more locations, or maybe they run the best deals and their pizzas are cheaper. There are other potential explanations for this phenomenon. And so we could describe this flaw directly in just that way. This argument is ignoring alternate explanations. We could describe this flaw through the assumption. We could say it assumes that this is the explanation for that, or it takes it for granted. Or we could describe this flaw in terms of something that would weaken the argument. This argument ignores the possibility that Vinny's pizzas are significantly cheaper than any other pizzas in the city, and that would be describing the flaw through the lens of what would weaken the argument. Some arguments just have big gaps. The premises are talking about something that's clearly different from what the conclusion is talking about, and the only way for the argument to make sense is if it has a linking assumption. And this type of flaw used to be a lot more common than it is these days, but there's still a really good chance you'll see at least a couple of them. So let's check out an example. It's now known that the most serious cases of depression are caused by chemical imbalances in the brain, so treatment with medicine must be more effective than treatment that doesn't have medicine. And here we're talking about the treatment, and up here we're talking about the cause being chemical. And so just because the cause is chemical doesn't mean that the best treatment is chemical, but that's what the argument is assuming. It's assuming that a treatment that uses the same mechanism as the cause will be more effective than one that doesn't. And this flaw will almost certainly be described in terms of the assumption. This would be like a takes for granted lead, and the flaw in this argument is that it takes for granted this assumption. So these logical gap or linking assumption flaws are almost always going to be framed in terms of what the argument needs. Flaws involving conditional statements are the most common types of flaws on more recent LSATs, and they usually show up as the converse fallacy or the inverse fallacy. So let's take a second to refresh on both of those. Here we have an argument. Our first premise is a conditional statement. All chefs are good at cooking. And then we're told that Rhett is good at cooking, therefore he must be a chef. So this is our sufficient condition, and it implies our necessary condition. But our necessary condition doesn't imply our sufficient condition. Being good at cooking doesn't guarantee that you're a chef, but this argument is acting as though it does. And so this argument has switched the sufficient and necessary conditions. That's the fallacy of the converse. The fallacy of the inverse is similar but different. So all chefs are good at cooking. Mike is not a chef, so he's not good at cooking. So our conditional statement is the same, but this time we're assuming that the opposite of the sufficient implies the opposite of the necessary. That's the inverse fallacy. This is what we're given, but we're acting as though we have this. And both of these moves are flawed. You're not allowed to do either of these things. Now, I want to talk about something a little bit complicated, and I'm not doing this just as an academic exercise. It's important to understand answer choices. So remember, the contrapositive of a statement is when you reverse and negate the terms. And that is an equivalent statement. So if all chefs are good at cooking, then if you're not good at cooking, you're not a chef. This is the contrapositive of that. And notice that the flaw down here is still the inverse of this original statement, but it looks like the converse of the contrapositive. The inverse of a statement is the converse of its contrapositive. And the reason I bring this up is because the LSAT is going to describe both of these flaws as a confusion of sufficiency and necessity. That's really easy to understand with the converse fallacy itself because you're just reversing the terms, but you can also describe the inverse as a confusion of sufficiency and necessity because it is the reversal of the contrapositive. So the inverse and the converse can both be described as a confusion of sufficiency and necessity, and it's really important to know that. Let's take a look at an example. Going back to my original converse argument, an answer choice, a right answer choice, might say that we've taken the fact that all members of a group have a certain property to constitute evidence that members of the group are the only things with that property. And this doesn't immediately scream sufficient and necessary, but if all members of a group have a certain property, then being in that group is sufficient. And when we say members of the group are the only things with that property, that means being in the group is necessary. So we can use synonyms for sufficiency and necessity. All is like a sufficient indicator, and only is like a necessary indicator. So this is a complicated answer choice to describe this problem. We could do it more straightforward if we just said the argument confuses a sufficient condition for a certain phenomenon with a necessary condition for that phenomenon. And they'll do that sometimes. By the way, the group here is the chefs, and the property is being good at cooking. Another flaw that shows up occasionally and involves conditional statements mistakes a conditional relationship for one of intensity. So if A implies B, that doesn't mean that more A implies more B. Here's an example. All good actors are empathetic, and Michael is a very good actor, but that doesn't mean that he must be very empathetic. Just because good acting implies empathy doesn't mean that more good acting implies more empathy. Conditional statements don't work like this, and I sometimes refer to this as the volume knob fallacy. It's as though if you turn up the volume on the left-hand side, you get a corresponding increase on the right-hand side. That's just not how things work. All conditional statements tell you is that if you have some of this term, you must have some of that term. But an increase in this term doesn't necessarily imply an increase in that term. So that's just another fallacy that you want to be on the lookout for involving conditional statements. When arguments start using numbers, that opens the door to a few potential problems, the most common of which is using an amount when you should be using a percentage. So one example from the LSAT says something along the lines of, last year 1,000 people died while crossing the street in the crosswalk, and only 100 people died while jaywalking. And so jaywalking must be safer. But you don't want to use the actual amount there. You want to talk about percentages, because it's possible that there were only 100 jaywalkers and they all died. That could have been like a 100% death rate, whereas perhaps 100,000 people crossed the street in a crosswalk, and that's only a 1% death rate. I'd much rather be in the crosswalk in that situation. And so when you want to assess how safe or how dangerous something is, it's important to use a percentage and not an absolute amount. Another numerical flaw is discussing the number of reasons and not considering the weight of those reasons. Just because you have 4 reasons to do something and 1 reason not to, doesn't mean you should do it, because the weight of the reason not to might outweigh all 4 of the reasons to do it. A third numerical problem is listing out pros while ignoring cons, or vice versa. You can think of this as a one-sided argument. Like, just because I give you 2 reasons to do something doesn't mean we should do it, because we haven't considered whether there are any good reasons not to do it, and vice versa. So anytime you're presented with a one-sided argument, you want to recognize that as being problematic. And it's also a mistake to misunderstand how averages work. Some people give averages too much credit, or they think they're too specific. Just because an event happens an average of once every 10 years and the last time it happened was 10 years ago, doesn't mean it has to happen right now. Averages have a little bit of wiggle room. It could happen in another 20 years and then again in 5 years. Averages don't always have to be the exact space apart. If just because something happens an average of every 10 years, doesn't mean the gap between occurrences is always 10 years. And finally, there's this idea that something could be better or worse, and I think this is best illustrated with an example, and so that's what I want to show you now. This is really similar to an actual LSAT question. It says the air quality in LA has been going up over the last 10 years, and we've been using cars the whole time. And so those people who think that cars harm air quality are mistaken. Like if you graph our air quality, it looks like this over time. But that doesn't mean that cars aren't harming the air quality. The idea is maybe it could be even better if we weren't driving all these cars around, right? Just because something is increasing doesn't mean that it's not being held down by some other force. Maybe it could be better. And the flip side is also fair game. Just because something is steadily decreasing doesn't mean that it's not being lifted up by some other force. Maybe it could be even worse. And so this is a common mathy problem on the LSAT. Just because something has a general tendency in one direction doesn't mean that there aren't forces operating in the other direction. Sampling flaws are also pretty common on the LSAT, but in order for this to apply to your situation, you have to have an argument that's based on a survey or some statistical evidence. And the first thing to know is that while the group size is kind of important, it's almost never the problem. You can have a really small sample and use it to predict the actions of a much larger group as long as the composition of the sample matches the composition of the larger group. There's something called the law of large numbers that helps out when we're predicting national elections. We can sample 2,000 people and predict what 300 million people are going to do because we get a really representative group of people together to survey. And so you can't just have 2 people in your sample, but it's almost never the sample size that's the problem. Usually the problem is the composition of the sample. You got to make sure that the people you're surveying are the same kinds of people that you are concluding about. If you want to draw conclusions about everybody, you can't just have a survey of college professors or factory workers. That would only be appropriate if you were concluding about college professors or factory workers. And you can't let your sample participants be self-selecting. They can't opt out. You can't just look at the respondents to a survey because the people who are unhappy are maybe less likely to respond. So it's important that you make sure that you sort of force an answer out of people whether they want to provide one or not. Otherwise, there's a chance that your conclusion is going to be skewed. And finally, you have to consider alternate explanations for any survey data that you find. So for example, if we have a magazine and we do a mail-in survey, 90% of people say they own a cat and only 15% of people say they have dogs. That doesn't necessarily mean that people prefer cats to dogs, unless this is like a general circulation magazine, like Time magazine or People magazine. If this is Cat Fancy magazine, that could explain our data. Or if it's a magazine for people who live in small apartments, that could explain why they have more cats than dogs. So it's always important to consider alternate explanations for any findings of your survey. It's important to be familiar with these top 5 most common categories of flaw. You're going to see them a lot in the homework, and in the next video we're going to talk about the next 5 most common categories of flaw.